You knew they were coming.
Marcus Washington said quietly to CEO Rachel Sterling as she stood frozen in the Platinum Dynamics parking garage at 9:47 p.m., surrounded by 3 unconscious attackers whose bodies lay twisted in positions that suggested professional violence rather than lucky self-defense. His observation cutting through her shock with the analytical precision of someone whose military training had taught him to recognize the difference between random crime and orchestrated assassination attempts. The garage's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the concrete floor, where 47 seconds of brutal efficiency had transformed what appeared to be a mugging into a scene that would require extensive explanation to both corporate security and metropolitan police, though Marcus understood that involving law enforcement could expose both his combat capabilities and Rachel's knowledge of the conspiracy that had made tonight's attack inevitable. At 41, Marcus possessed the kind of controlled lethality that characterized former Special Operations personnel, moving through civilian environments while maintaining hypervigilance that made him aware of threats that others missed, which executives stayed late to avoid surveillance, whose security protocols suggested insider knowledge, whose behavioral patterns indicated they were being hunted by people with professional training and corporate access. But the tactical sophistication of tonight's attackers, combined with Rachel's complete lack of surprise about being targeted for elimination, represented something far more dangerous than corporate espionage. Someone with detailed knowledge of her schedule and security routines had orchestrated murder disguised as random violence, using professionals whose equipment and coordination indicated government or military training rather than common criminal activity. "How did you—" Rachel began, her voice shaking as she processed that her company's night janitor had just neutralized 3 armed attackers with hand-to-hand combat techniques that exceeded anything she had seen outside of action movies, while simultaneously demonstrating situational awareness that suggested he had been anticipating violence rather than accidentally encountering it. "Ma'am, those men were using tactical positioning and military-grade weapons," Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying the controlled authority he had once used when briefing Navy SEAL teams about high-value target elimination protocols. "This wasn't a random mugging. It was a professional hit, and someone with access to your corporate security briefed them about your location and timing." At 33, Rachel Sterling possessed the striking blonde beauty and inherited executive authority that had enabled her to maintain control of Platinum Dynamics through 2 years of learning that her pharmaceutical empire was built on systematic fraud, though her recent discoveries about embezzled cancer research funds had apparently triggered elimination protocols that someone had been planning for months. "You can't possibly know that from a 40-second fight," Rachel replied, though her defensive tone suggested growing awareness that Marcus's analysis was both accurate and terrifyingly informed by expertise that contradicted every assumption about custodial worker qualifications and situational awareness capabilities. "Ma'am, the lead attacker was carrying encrypted communication equipment and using hand signals that indicated military training," Marcus explained, drawing on reconnaissance skills that had made him valuable for counterterrorism operations before his career had been destroyed by moral objections to civilian casualties. These men were professionals hired to eliminate a specific target, not opportunistic criminals looking for easy money. What did he do? The assessment was both technically accurate and strategically dangerous, since acknowledging that Rachel had been targeted for assassination required confronting that someone with intimate knowledge of corporate operations had access to military contractors willing to commit murder for financial compensation. "How do you know about military tactics and professional assassination?" Rachel asked, her question carrying both fear and growing respect for capabilities that seemed impossible to reconcile with Marcus's employment status and social position. The inquiry forced Marcus to confront the most complex period of his recent life, when his refusal to execute civilians during a classified operation in Afghanistan had resulted in court-martial proceedings that eliminated his military career, pension, and security clearance, while forcing him into civilian employment that didn't match his qualifications or training. "I was a Navy SEAL for 12 years before circumstances made it necessary to accept civilian employment," Marcus replied, using diplomatic language that acknowledged his background without providing details about moral conflicts and legal proceedings that had destroyed his professional identity. "Navy SEALs don't usually work as custodial staff," Rachel observed, her tone shifting from shock to analytical assessment as she processed information that challenged her understanding of both social hierarchy and institutional systems that could reduce elite military personnel to service work. Ms. Sterling, career transitions sometimes involve circumstances that make previous qualifications inaccessible for continued professional practice, Marcus said, maintaining focus on immediate security threats rather than personal history that could complicate their current situation. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching sirens. Someone had called emergency services about gunshots in the parking garage, creating time pressure for decisions about how to explain the scene without exposing either Marcus's combat capabilities or Rachel's knowledge of the assassination conspiracy. "Marcus, we need to leave immediately," Rachel announced, her executive decision-making overriding shock as she recognized that police investigation could expose corporate conspiracy while eliminating the only person whose skills could protect her from future assassination attempts. "Ma'am, leaving a crime scene creates legal complications that could affect both your corporate liability and my employment status," Marcus replied, using practical caution that balanced immediate security needs against long-term legal consequences. "But staying here requires explaining why a janitor was able to defeat 3 armed attackers without sustaining injury, and why the CEO of a pharmaceutical company was in the parking garage at 9:47 p.m. without security escort," Rachel countered, her analysis revealing strategic thinking that corporate leadership had developed for crisis management. The decision was complicated by Marcus's recognition that Rachel's lack of surprise about the attack indicated prior knowledge of threats against her life, suggesting that tonight's violence represented escalation in ongoing conflict rather than isolated criminal activity. "Ms. Sterling, before we decide how to handle this situation, I need to know why you weren't surprised when those men tried to kill you," Marcus said, his voice carrying the interrogation techniques he had learned for extracting information from hostile sources during combat operations. "Because I discovered 3 weeks ago that someone at Platinum Dynamics has been embezzling funds from our pediatric cancer research program," Rachel replied, her admission confirming that corporate crime had escalated to attempted murder when financial fraud had been exposed through her investigation. "And because the financial evidence suggests that whoever is stealing from dying children has enough resources to hire professional killers when their theft is threatened by executive oversight and audit procedures." And as emergency vehicles approached the parking garage while Marcus and Rachel faced decisions about cooperation with law enforcement that could either expose the conspiracy or eliminate their ability to prevent future assassination attempts, both participants understood that corporate crime involving children's medical research had created stakes that transcended personal safety or professional liability. Some discoveries about immediate danger reveal that corporate environments can harbor systematic evil that will kill to protect financial gain, and that protecting vulnerable communities sometimes requires accepting that law enforcement systems aren't equipped to handle conspiracy that involves both government contractors and pharmaceutical industry corruption that sacrifices children's lives for executive profit margins. The investigation that would force both Marcus and Rachel to confront their deepest assumptions about institutional loyalty and moral compromise began at 6:15 a.m. the following morning, when Marcus arrived at his modest apartment in Brooklyn to find his 15-year-old daughter Zoe sitting at their kitchen table surrounded by 3 laptops, multiple external hard drives, and printed financial documents that suggested she had spent the night infiltrating Platinum Dynamics' corporate network to uncover the conspiracy that had nearly killed her father and his employer. "Dad, you're not going to believe what I found in the pharmaceutical company's encrypted files," Zoe said without looking up from her screens, her teenage voice carrying the controlled excitement that characterized gifted hackers who had discovered systematic criminal activity through digital investigation that exceeded most professional cybersecurity capabilities. Marcus felt the familiar conflict between pride in his daughter's intellectual abilities and concern about her illegal activities that could result in federal prosecution if her penetration of corporate systems was discovered by law enforcement or cybersecurity professionals hired to protect pharmaceutical industry trade secrets. "Zoe, I need you to understand that accessing corporate computer networks without authorization is a federal crime that could result in prosecution and imprisonment regardless of what information you discover," Marcus said, using the careful authority that single fathers learned for managing teenage children whose capabilities exceeded their judgment about legal consequences and personal safety. "Dad, the financial records show that someone at Platinum Dynamics has stolen over $40 million from pediatric cancer research over the past 3 years, Zoe replied, her 15-year-old directness cutting through adult concerns about legal technicalities when children's lives were being sacrificed for executive profit. "They're stealing money that was supposed to fund treatment for kids who are dying." Udizn, the revelation was both morally devastating and strategically crucial, confirming that last night's assassination attempt had been motivated by financial crime that involved systematic theft from medical research, rather than just corporate power struggles or business competition that could be resolved through legal channels. Meanwhile, Rachel Sterling was experiencing her own moral crisis as her investigation into Platinum Dynamics' financial irregularities had revealed that her family's pharmaceutical empire had been systematically exploiting vulnerable communities, while her board of directors participated in conspiracy that prioritized executive compensation over medical research and patient care. "Ms. Sterling, I need to discuss the corporate liability implications of last night's incident and your decision to leave the scene without cooperating with police investigation," said General Counsel Patricia Morrison during their emergency legal consultation, her voice carrying controlled concern about executive decision-making that could affect both personal criminal exposure and corporate regulatory compliance. "Patricia, cooperating with police investigation would have required explaining why a custodial worker possessed military combat training, and why I wasn't surprised about being targeted for assassination," Rachel replied, though her defensive tone suggested growing awareness that avoiding law enforcement could create additional legal complications while failing to address the underlying conspiracy. "Ms. Sterling, your knowledge of assassination threats combined with your employment of personnel with undisclosed military backgrounds creates potential liability for both corporate security violations and failure to report criminal activity," Patricia continued, using legal analysis that transformed protective decision-making into evidence of systematic institutional problems. The conversation forced Rachel to balance her legal obligations against recognition that conventional law enforcement wasn't equipped to handle conspiracy that involved both corporate crime and professional assassination, particularly when government contractors were involved in elimination of witnesses and whistleblowers. As Marcus processed Zoe's digital evidence while Rachel navigated legal complications that could expose or protect the conspiracy, both participants understood that children's medical care was being sacrificed for financial gain that involved people with resources to eliminate anyone who threatened their systematic theft from vulnerable families. Dad, the financial transfers show that the stolen cancer research money is being moved through offshore accounts controlled by Thomas Bradley, the company's chief financial officer, Zoe reported during their morning conversation, her hacking investigation providing evidence that could either expose systematic crime or make their family targets for professional elimination. Zoe, CFO Bradley, has access to both corporate security information and financial resources that could make our family extremely dangerous targets if he discovers that we have evidence of his embezzlement, Marcus replied, using tactical assessment that balanced his daughter's investigative capabilities against security risks that could affect their survival and safety. But Dad, if we don't expose the theft, hundreds of children with cancer won't get the treatments that could save their lives, Zoe countered, her teenage moral clarity conflicting with adult awareness of how financial crime involving government contracts often eliminated witnesses through professional violence rather than legal intimidation. The family conversation revealed the ethical complexity of possessing evidence that could save children's lives while potentially destroying their own family through retaliation from people whose criminal activity involved both systematic theft and professional assassination capabilities. Over the following hours, as Rachel's internal investigation confirmed that Thomas Bradley had been systematically embezzling pediatric cancer research funds while coordinating with government contractors who provided both offshore financial services and elimination capabilities for whistleblowers, all participants understood that protecting vulnerable children would require accepting personal risks that could result in their own deaths. Marcus, I need to know if you're willing to provide security consultation for exposing systematic theft from children's medical research, Rachel said during their encrypted phone conversation, her executive decision-making recognizing that conventional corporate security wasn't adequate for confronting conspiracy that involved both financial crime and professional assassination. Ms. Sterling, protecting children from people who steal their medical treatment funding is always the right choice, even when it creates personal danger for our families, Marcus replied, using moral framework that had guided his military service before institutional corruption had forced him to choose between career advancement and ethical principles. But I also need you to understand that exposing Bradley's embezzlement will likely trigger escalated assassination attempts that could target both our families rather than just corporate executives, Marcus continued, providing tactical assessment that acknowledged both moral necessity and practical consequences of confronting systematic criminal activity. The conversation established collaborative commitment to child protection that transcended both personal safety and professional liability, while acknowledging that systematic corruption involving government contractors often eliminated threats through violence rather than legal or financial pressure. Some moral choices require understanding that protecting children from systematic exploitation often involves accepting personal risks that could result in professional assassination, and that exposing financial crime sometimes requires collaborative courage that prioritizes vulnerable communities over individual safety when institutional systems have been corrupted beyond legal remediation. 3 weeks after Zoe's hacking had exposed Thomas Bradley's systematic embezzlement of $43 million from pediatric cancer research, while revealing government contractor connections that suggested assassination capabilities, Marcus Washington found himself sitting in the federal courthouse at 2:30 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon, facing questions from FBI investigators about why he hadn't reported his military background during employment screening processes that were designed to identify security risks and personnel with classified training. "Mr. Washington," said Special Agent Jennifer Torres, her voice carrying the prosecutorial tone that federal investigators used when suggesting that civilian employment after military service represented potential security violations rather than economic necessity. "Your failure to disclose Navy SEAL training during corporate employment application creates concerns about both your intentions and your employer's knowledge of your capabilities." The accusation was both legally sophisticated and personally devastating, transforming Marcus's need for employment into evidence of potential espionage or corporate infiltration that could result in federal prosecution while eliminating his ability to protect either his family or the children whose medical research funding had been stolen by pharmaceutical executives. "Agent Torres, my military service was honorably completed, and my current employment represents legitimate work necessary for supporting my daughter," Marcus replied, using careful language that acknowledged his background without providing details about court-martial proceedings that had ended his military career through moral objections to civilian casualties. "But Mr. Washington, your specialized combat training combined with your access to corporate facilities and executive personnel creates security implications that should have been disclosed during background investigation," Torres continued, using federal logic that treated protective capabilities as potential threats when they existed outside official institutional oversight. The interrogation revealed how government systems often viewed former military personnel as security risks rather than protective assets, particularly when their employment circumstances suggested economic desperation that could make them vulnerable to foreign recruitment or criminal activity. Meanwhile, Rachel Sterling was experiencing her own institutional crisis as her board of directors had discovered her collaboration with federal investigators and were threatening to remove her from corporate leadership, while suggesting that her paranoid accusations against Thomas Bradley represented psychological instability rather than legitimate concern about embezzled medical research funding. "Rachel, your allegations against Thomas are creating regulatory scrutiny that could destroy Platinum Dynamics government contracts and pharmaceutical partnerships," warned Board Chairman Robert Hayes during their emergency executive session. "If you can't provide conclusive evidence of financial irregularities, the board will be forced to consider leadership changes that could protect corporate stability. Robert, I have digital evidence showing that Thomas has systematically stolen over $40 million from pediatric cancer research," Rachel replied, though her defensive tone suggested growing awareness that institutional loyalty often protected financial crime. When exposing it, threatened corporate relationships and government contract revenue. "But Rachel, digital evidence obtained through unauthorized network access could be inadmissible in legal proceedings while creating liability for corporate cybersecurity violations," Hayes continued, using legal technicalities to discourage investigation that could expose systematic corruption affecting both pharmaceutical industry and government contractor relationships. The board pressure was both predictable and strategically effective, since corporate governance often prioritized institutional protection over moral accountability when criminal activity involved people with resources to eliminate whistleblowers and evidence through professional retaliation. As Marcus faced potential federal prosecution while Rachel confronted board removal, 15-year-old Zoe Washington was experiencing her own crisis when her hacking activities attracted attention from cybersecurity professionals whose investigation could either validate her evidence or result in federal charges that would destroy her educational prospects and family stability. Dad, someone has been trying to trace my digital footprints back to our home network, Zoe reported during their evening security conversation, her teenage voice carrying anxiety about consequences that could affect their family's survival. The corporate cybersecurity team knows that someone accessed their financial records, and they're using government-level tracking software to identify the source. Zoe, if federal investigators discover that you penetrated Platinum Dynamics network security, you could face prosecution under cybercrime laws that don't distinguish between criminal hacking and whistleblowing activity, Marcus replied, his voice carrying the protective concern that characterized single fathers whose children's capabilities had exceeded their judgment about legal consequences. But Dad, if they prosecute me for exposing the theft, what happens to all the children who won't get cancer treatment because Thomas Bradley stole their research funding? Zoe asked, her 15-year-old moral clarity conflicting with adult awareness of how legal systems often punished whistleblowers rather than protecting the communities they were trying to help. The family conversation revealed the ethical complexity of possessing evidence that could save children's lives while facing prosecution that could destroy the very families trying to expose systematic crime against vulnerable communities. Over the following days, as federal investigation intensified while corporate retaliation threatened both Marcus's employment and Rachel's executive authority, all participants understood that protecting pediatric cancer research would require accepting personal sacrifices that could eliminate their ability to provide ongoing advocacy for children whose medical treatment depended on exposing and stopping systematic embezzlement. Marcus, I need you to understand that continuing to provide security consultation could result in federal charges that affect your custody of Zoe, Rachel said during one of their encrypted strategy meetings, her executive responsibility recognizing that collaborative child protection shouldn't require individual family destruction. Rachel, protecting children from people who steal their medical treatment funding is worth accepting personal legal risk, Marcus replied, using the moral framework that had guided his military service before institutional corruption had forced him to choose between career advancement and ethical principles. But I also need you to know that if federal prosecution eliminates my ability to care for Zoe, she'll become vulnerable to retaliation from people whose criminal activity we're exposing, Marcus continued, acknowledging that systematic corruption often targeted family members when primary whistleblowers became inaccessible through imprisonment or elimination. The conversation established that institutional protection for children often required accepting that individual families might be destroyed through legal retaliation, while systematic crime continued affecting vulnerable communities whose advocates had been eliminated through prosecution or professional assassination. As Thomas Bradley's legal team launched counter-investigations designed to discredit both Marcus's military background and Zoe's digital evidence, while suggesting that Rachel's leadership represented corporate instability rather than anti-corruption advocacy, all participants understood that exposing systematic theft from children's medical research had created a battle between institutional power and moral courage that would determine both their personal survival and the welfare of hundreds of children whose lives depended on cancer research funding. Agent Torres, I want to provide full cooperation with federal investigation of embezzled pediatric cancer research funding, Marcus announced during his follow-up FBI interview, accepting that transparency about his background might result in prosecution while prioritizing child protection over personal safety. But I also need you to understand that my family's security depends on stopping people who have demonstrated willingness to use professional assassination against anyone who threatens their theft from dying children. Some sacrifices require understanding that protecting vulnerable children from systematic exploitation often involves accepting legal prosecution that could destroy the very families trying to expose institutional crime, and that moral courage sometimes requires choosing community welfare over personal survival when government systems have been corrupted to protect financial crime rather than vulnerable populations. 6 weeks after FBI investigation had confirmed Thomas Bradley's embezzlement, while revealing that his offshore financial network included CIA contractors who provided both money laundering services and wet work elimination for pharmaceutical executives threatened by regulatory oversight, Dr. Sarah Chen arrived at the secure FBI facility in Manhattan, carrying research evidence that would expose systematic government corruption extending far beyond corporate theft to include assassination of researchers whose cancer treatment breakthroughs threatened pharmaceutical industry profit margins. Agent Torres, I've been investigating the murder of my research partner, Dr. Michael Rodriguez, whose pediatric cancer treatment breakthrough was suppressed after he refused to sell his patents to Platinum Dynamics, Dr. Chen said, as she reviewed classified documents in the federal conference room that had become headquarters for investigating conspiracy involving both corporate crime and government assassination programs. Marcus looked up from security briefings with the focused attention that characterized former military personnel processing intelligence about institutional corruption that exceeded typical corporate fraud, to include systematic elimination of medical researchers whose discoveries threatened established pharmaceutical profit structures. Dr. Chen, what specific evidence connects Dr. Rodriguez's death to Thomas Bradley's embezzlement scheme? Agent Torres asked, her voice carrying the careful authority that federal investigators used when processing information that could expose government contractor involvement in civilian assassination programs. Michael's research demonstrated that childhood leukemia could be treated effectively using generic medications costing under $50 per patient. Dr. Chen replied, her clinical assessment revealing how medical breakthroughs had been suppressed through murder rather than allowed to save children's lives through affordable treatment options. Thomas Bradley offered Michael $12 million for exclusive patent rights, and when Michael refused to limit access to life-saving treatment, he died in a car accident that forensic analysis suggests was professionally orchestrated rather than mechanical failure. The revelation meant that Bradley's financial crime had been motivated by systematic suppression of medical breakthroughs rather than just personal enrichment, creating conspiracy that involved both pharmaceutical industry protection and government contractor elimination of researchers whose discoveries threatened established treatment monopolies. Meanwhile, Rachel Sterling was experiencing her own awakening to systematic corruption, as her investigation had revealed that Platinum Dynamics' board of directors included former CIA officials whose pharmaceutical industry relationships enabled assassination programs disguised as regulatory oversight and competitive business practices. Rachel, the federal investigation has identified 12 researchers whose deaths correlate with pharmaceutical patent disputes involving government contractors, Agent Torres reported during their collaborative planning session. Your company appears to have been used as a front for systematic elimination of medical innovation that threatened established treatment profit margins. Agent Torres, are you saying that my family's pharmaceutical company has been participating in murder of medical researchers? Rachel asked, her voice carrying both shock and growing awareness that inherited corporate leadership had involved systematic criminal activity affecting vulnerable children and their families. Ms. Sterling, the evidence suggests that your board of directors approved elimination protocols for researchers whose discoveries threatened pharmaceutical industry revenue streams, Torres replied, providing federal assessment that transformed corporate inheritance into moral responsibility for systematic assassination and medical suppression. The information forced Rachel to confront that her privilege had been built on systematic murder of people whose medical discoveries could have saved thousands of children's lives through affordable treatment options that threatened pharmaceutical industry profit margins. As their alliance expanded to include Dr. Chen's medical evidence, while federal investigation revealed the scope of assassination programs involving both CIA contractors and pharmaceutical industry executives, all participants understood that protecting children from systematic medical suppression would require exposing government corruption that had eliminated researchers and suppressed life-saving treatments for decades. Zoe, your hacking has uncovered financial transfers that connect Bradley's embezzlement to assassination contracts for medical researchers, Marcus explained during their family security briefing, his voice carrying both pride in his daughter's capabilities and concern about government retaliation that could target their family for exposing CIA contractor involvement in pharmaceutical industry crime. Dad, the financial records show that they've killed researchers in 7 different countries, whose cancer treatments would have cost less than current pharmaceutical monopolies, Zoe replied, her 15-year-old analysis providing digital evidence that revealed systematic international conspiracy to suppress medical innovation through professional assassination. But Zoe, exposing CIA contractor assassination programs creates security risks that extend beyond corporate retaliation to include government elimination protocols for whistleblowers who threaten classified operations, Marcus continued, using tactical assessment that balanced his daughter's investigative success against federal capabilities for eliminating families whose evidence could expose systematic government crime. The family conversation revealed how collaborative investigation had evolved beyond corporate embezzlement to include systematic government suppression of medical breakthroughs that could have saved thousands of children's lives through affordable treatment options that threatened established pharmaceutical profit structures. Over the following weeks, as Dr. Chen's research evidence combined with Zoe's financial documentation, while Agent Torres coordinated federal protection for witnesses whose testimony could expose both CIA contractor assassination programs and pharmaceutical industry's systematic suppression of life-saving medical discoveries. All participants understood that protecting vulnerable children required confronting institutional corruption that had been eliminating medical innovation for decades. Marcus, the Federal Protection Program can provide security for your family while we build cases against both corporate embezzlement and government assassination programs, Agent Torres offered during their collaboration meeting, recognizing that witness protection might be necessary for families whose evidence could expose systematic corruption affecting both pharmaceutical industry and CIA contractor operations. Agent Torres, accepting federal protection means trusting the same government systems that have been participating in assassination of medical researchers, Marcus replied, his military experience making him skeptical of institutional protection when evidence suggested systematic corruption involving multiple government agencies. But Marcus, independent security for our families isn't adequate against CIA contractor elimination capabilities, Rachel added, her executive assessment recognizing that corporate resources couldn't protect against government assassination programs that had been operating internationally for decades. The strategic discussion revealed how collaborative whistleblowing often required accepting protection from the same institutional systems whose corruption was being exposed, creating dependency relationships that could either ensure survival or facilitate elimination of witnesses whose testimony threatened systematic government crime. As evidence accumulated that pharmaceutical industry profit margins had been protected through systematic assassination of medical researchers whose discoveries could have provided affordable cancer treatment for thousands of children, All participants understood that their alliance represented both the greatest threat to established corruption and the most vulnerable target for elimination protocols that had been eliminating medical innovation through professional violence rather than scientific competition. Some alliances require understanding that exposing systematic suppression of medical breakthroughs often involves confronting both corporate crime and government assassination programs, and that protecting vulnerable children from institutional corruption sometimes requires accepting federal protection while maintaining skepticism about the same systems whose criminal activity is being exposed through collaborative investigation and whistleblowing. The crisis that would determine whether hundreds of children received life-saving cancer treatment or died protecting pharmaceutical industry profits reached its peak when Thomas Bradley activated emergency corporate takeover protocols, simultaneously triggering assassination contracts against all federal witnesses while announcing that Platinum Dynamics would cease pediatric cancer research indefinitely due to regulatory complications and security concerns. Agent Torres. Bradley has just transferred $87 million to CIA contractor accounts while issuing termination orders for all research personnel, Zoe reported from the secure FBI facility, where her hacking capabilities had become essential for tracking financial transfers that occurred faster than legal intervention could prevent systematic elimination of evidence and witnesses. The announcement meant that Thomas's desperation had escalated beyond personal protection to include systematic destruction of medical research that could save thousands of children's lives, creating time pressure for intervention that required immediate action rather than legal proceedings that could take months while children died from treatable diseases. Marcus, we have intelligence suggesting that Bradley's assassination teams are targeting the Children's Hospital where Dr. Chen's research is being conducted, Agent Torres announced during their emergency briefing, her voice carrying federal urgency about threats that extended beyond witness protection to include mass casualty events designed to eliminate medical evidence and research personnel. Agent Torres, how many children are currently receiving treatment at the hospital? Marcus asked, his tactical assessment recognizing that protecting pediatric cancer patients required military-level security against CIA contractor elimination capabilities that exceeded typical law enforcement response protocols. 137 children are currently undergoing experimental treatment using Dr. Rodriguez's affordable cancer therapy protocols. Dr. Chen replied, her voice breaking as she processed that corporate crime had escalated to potential mass murder of children whose only crime was receiving life-saving medical treatment that threatened pharmaceutical industry profit margins. The revelation forced all participants to confront that systematic corruption had reached the point where children's lives were considered acceptable casualties for protecting established medical monopolies and government contractor relationships that prioritized financial gain over human survival. Meanwhile, Rachel Sterling was experiencing her own ultimate confrontation, as her board of directors had voted to terminate her executive authority while authorizing Bradley to implement crisis management protocols that included both corporate asset liquidation and elimination of personnel whose testimony could expose decades of systematic assassination and medical suppression. Rachel, the board has determined that your cooperation with federal investigation represents corporate betrayal that threatens both shareholder value and employee security, Chairman Robert Hayes announced during the emergency meeting that would determine whether Platinum Dynamics continued operating as a pharmaceutical company or became liquidated to pay CIA contractor elimination services. Robert, continuing to protect Bradley's embezzlement means accepting responsibility for systematic murder of medical researchers and denial of cancer treatment to hundreds of children, Rachel replied, her voice carrying executive authority that had been refined through moral clarity rather than institutional compliance. But Rachel, exposing corporate relationships with government contractors, could result in federal prosecution of board members who were unaware of assassination programs. Hayes continued, using legal fear to maintain institutional protection despite moral evidence of systematic child endangerment. The confrontation revealed how corporate governance often prioritized legal liability over moral accountability, when systematic crime involved both government contracts and pharmaceutical industry relationships that had been profitable for decades through suppression of medical innovation. As Bradley's assassination teams approached the children's hospital while federal agents coordinated emergency evacuation procedures that could either save or expose vulnerable patients to retaliation violence, Marcus faced the ultimate choice between family protection and community defense that would define both his moral character and the survival chances for hundreds of children whose treatment depended on stopping systematic medical suppression. Zoe, I need you to understand that protecting the children's hospital might require me to use military capabilities that could result in my death or federal prosecution, Marcus said during their final family conversation, before the confrontation that would determine whether affordable cancer treatment survived or was eliminated through professional violence. Dad, if you don't stop the assassination teams, hundreds of kids will die because evil people want to keep cancer treatment expensive, Zoe replied, her 15-year-old moral clarity cutting through adult concerns about personal consequences when children's lives hung in the balance. But Zoe, if I die protecting the hospital, you'll be alone without family protection against people who eliminate witnesses and their families, Marcus continued, acknowledging that moral courage sometimes required accepting that protective parents might not survive the battles necessary for community defense. Dad, you taught me that protecting people who can't protect themselves is always worth the risk, Zoe countered, using the values that Marcus had instilled through years of single parenting and military service ethics that prioritized community welfare over individual safety. The family conversation represented the culmination of moral education that had prepared both father and daughter for situations where personal sacrifice might be necessary for protecting vulnerable communities from systematic institutional violence. Over the following hours, a CIA contractor team surrounded the children's hospital while federal agents coordinated with Marcus's tactical expertise to create defensive perimeters that could protect both patients and medical research from professional elimination. All participants understood that the battle represented systematic conflict between institutional corruption and moral courage that would determine whether affordable medical treatment survived or was eliminated through violence. Dr. Chen, I need you to secure all research data while we coordinate hospital defense, Marcus announced as he reviewed tactical positions that could either protect or expose children's cancer treatment to systematic destruction by people whose financial interests required maintaining medical monopolies through assassination and research suppression. Marcus, the research data represents 5 years of work that could save thousands of children's lives, Dr. Chen replied, her voice carrying the desperate hope that characterized medical professionals whose discoveries had been targeted for elimination by people who prioritized profit margins over human survival. As the final confrontation began, with CIA contractor teams attempting to breach hospital security, while Marcus coordinated defensive operations that utilized both federal resources and his SEAL training to protect children whose only crime was receiving affordable cancer treatment. All participants understood that systematic institutional corruption would either be stopped through individual courage or continue eliminating medical innovation through professional violence and government-sanctioned assassination programs. Some confrontations require understanding that protecting children from systematic medical suppression often involves accepting that individual heroes might not survive the battles necessary for community defense, and that moral courage sometimes requires choosing vulnerable community welfare over personal survival, when institutional corruption has eliminated legal alternatives for stopping systematic crime against defenseless populations. 18 months after Thomas Bradley had been sentenced to life imprisonment for conspiracy to commit murder and systematic embezzlement, while CIA contractor assassination programs had been exposed through congressional investigation that resulted in pharmaceutical industry regulation and affordable cancer treatment access for thousands of children. Marcus Washington stood in his new office at the FBI's Corporate Crime Task Force headquarters, reviewing case files while preparing for Zoe's graduation from MIT's accelerated cybersecurity program that had emerged from federal scholarship opportunities created for families whose whistleblowing had exposed systematic government corruption. The transformation was both personally meaningful and institutionally significant, since Marcus's transition from custodial work to federal law enforcement consultation had required congressional testimony that reformed both military veteran employment and pharmaceutical industry oversight, while creating systematic protections for medical researchers whose discoveries could benefit vulnerable communities. Dad, I still can't believe that saving one person from getting murdered led to reforming the entire pharmaceutical research system, Zoe said during their weekend conversation in the three-bedroom apartment that Marcus's federal consultant salary had made possible while maintaining the modest lifestyle that their shared values had established as sufficient for family happiness and community service. At 17, Zoe possessed cybersecurity expertise that had attracted attention from federal agencies seeking ethical hackers whose moral framework prioritized community protection over financial gain. Though her academic success had been balanced by awareness that professional achievement required both technical competence and ongoing commitment to vulnerable populations whose welfare depended on continued advocacy and institutional oversight. Zoe, what I've learned through this experience is that individual courage becomes meaningful when it's used for systematic change that helps other families, Marcus replied, using insights that federal work had provided about collaborative problem-solving and institutional reform that transcended individual success stories. The pharmaceutical industry reforms and medical research protections represent systematic changes that could save thousands of children's lives rather than just solving one crisis or protecting one family. Meanwhile, Rachel Sterling was experiencing her own continued evolution as her leadership of reformed Platinum Dynamics had transformed corporate culture beyond damage control to include systematic commitment to affordable medical research and authentic community partnerships that created measurable health benefits for vulnerable populations rather than just profitable treatment monopolies. Rachel, the Affordable Cancer Treatment Program has provided life-saving therapy to over 800 children whose families couldn't afford traditional pharmaceutical pricing, reported Chief Medical Officer Dr. Sarah Chen during their quarterly review of research outcomes and community health impact. Additionally, the open-source medical research protocols have been adopted by hospitals in 37 countries, creating global access to treatments that were previously available only to wealthy patients in developed nations. The assessment confirmed that institutional change had created sustainable improvements for both medical research and community health, while generating international recognition for pharmaceutical industry reform that prioritized patient welfare over profit margins and shareholder value. As Platinum Dynamics became a model for ethical pharmaceutical development, while Marcus's federal consultation helped establish protocols for protecting medical researchers from industry retaliation and government assassination programs, both leaders understood that systematic reform required ongoing commitment rather than crisis response or individual achievement recognition. Over the following months, Dr. Sarah Chen was expanding affordable cancer research through collaboration with international medical organizations, whose work demonstrated that systematic industry reform could create global health improvements while maintaining pharmaceutical innovation and economic sustainability for companies committed to patient welfare rather than profit maximization. The Platinum Dynamics case has demonstrated that pharmaceutical companies can remain profitable while providing affordable treatment access. Dr. Chen wrote in her research summary for the New England Journal of Medicine. Marcus Washington and Rachel Sterling's partnership illustrates how crisis intervention can create systematic reform that benefits both individual patients and global health systems, while Zoe Washington's cybersecurity expertise demonstrates how technical capabilities can be used for community protection rather than just personal advancement or corporate espionage. The academic documentation provided evidence that collaborative approaches to pharmaceutical reform created benefits for vulnerable populations while generating replicable models for industry regulation that could be adapted across different economic and cultural contexts. As their extended professional family continued evolving through Zoe's cybersecurity career, Marcus's federal consultation, Rachel's corporate leadership, and Dr. Chen's research expansion, all participants understood that sustainable social change required collaborative commitment to both individual healing and institutional reform rather than just personal success or corporate public relations management. Zoe, what I want you to understand as you begin your cybersecurity career with the federal government, Marcus said during their family celebration after her MIT graduation, is that your technical abilities are meant to be used for protecting communities that need advocacy and institutional oversight, not just for personal professional advancement or corporate security contracts. Dad, what I've learned through our family's experience is that using computer skills to help expose people who hurt vulnerable communities makes me feel stronger about my own abilities and more connected to the values you taught me about service and protection, Zoe replied, her 17-year-old perspective combining individual growth with social awareness about technical responsibility and community engagement. And what I've discovered is that the reason you and Agent Torres work well together isn't just because you both understand law enforcement. It's because you both prioritize protecting people who can't protect themselves from systematic institutional violence. The insight reflected mature understanding of professional partnership that honored individual expertise while embracing collaborative commitment to vulnerable community protection, demonstrating how systematic reform could transform personal trauma into wisdom that benefited both family development and social contribution. 3 years later, Marcus stood in the congressional hearing room where pharmaceutical industry oversight legislation was being signed into law, watching Rachel testify about corporate responsibility, while Zoe provided cybersecurity consultation to senators whose understanding of digital evidence had been enhanced through technical education that prioritized community protection over government surveillance capabilities. Marcus, Rachel said, as their collaborative work continued expanding to multiple industries and international partnerships, I want you to know that your courage in protecting me from assassination opened my eyes to systematic corruption that I had been unconsciously participating in through inherited privilege and institutional loyalty. Rachel, what I've learned through our partnership is that corporate leadership requires recognizing when individual moral courage needs to be supported by institutional change that addresses systematic problems rather than just individual criminal activity, Marcus replied, using language that acknowledged both personal growth and ongoing commitment to vulnerable community protection through collaborative reform and oversight. The conversation reflected friendship that had transcended crisis intervention to include genuine mutual respect and shared commitment to systematic social change that created sustainable protections for vulnerable populations rather than just individual success stories or corporate reputation management. Some families, they had discovered, were created through collaborative commitment to community protection, and that the most meaningful professional achievement often emerged from using individual expertise through institutional partnerships that valued human welfare while creating systematic safeguards against corruption that prioritize profit over life, particularly when vulnerable children's survival depended on affordable medical access and research innovation protected from assassination and suppression.